I'm self-made, mostly in the ad tech space. So from 2010 to 2020, I ran a form of owned and operated technology incubator, where the team that I assembled and one of them's here, Mr. Nick Jackson, who spent more money on the internet than just about anyone alive. We were Google's single largest customer, larger than Amazon, larger than eBay. We had the #1 weather app in the iOS and Android app stores, and we comprised more than 5% of companies like Yahoo's revenue. And at that incubator, over those 10 years, we created a little over a dozen successful tech companies. Most of them reaching 8 figures, a couple of them reaching 9 figures. Some of those were individually sold. And in 2016, my partner, Rodrigo Salez, and Rodrigo is the racing behind ROC. He just placed second in Le Mans. Aaron and Dave and my beautiful wife Michelle and I were there to witness it. In 2016, we sold the incubator to a Chinese publicly traded company for an 11x multiple. It ended up being a little over $250 million transaction. I stuck around for the earnout and continued to grow the business, especially with dividends released and the capital constraints released. We were really able to hit the gas hard. By 2017, these are some heady days. It's that time in any technology business, often called inside the tornado. We were growing by over $30 million every month. And we did that month over month over month, to the point where we were making over $1 million a day across the portfolio of businesses. So that's half the story. And normally that's kind of where I stop, but this being the event it is tonight, I need to tell you guys the other half too, which is I was also sick, really sick. My story is similar to Wolfgang's. And so this one, as you can tell, is not just an amazing investment to me, it's also highly personal. It also means that I have a deeper level of conviction around this bet than I have about any other one. And the reason for that is, over a period of about 20 years, I kicked around the medical system, went from specialist to specialist, tried to find answers. And there were no answers to be had. Just to give you guys a flavor, and this is, the reason I'm telling you guys this is because this is my story, but it's also a very common story for anyone with chronic inflammatory conditions, mast cell disease. You might have, yourself have some similar, find this resonates with you, or you might find it resonates with a family member. But when I was in my early 20s, I was diagnosed with both fibromyalgia as well as trigeminal neuralgia, which is numbness and pain here. I recently found out it's actually called the suicide nerve because it's so painful and it's so damn distracting and annoying. By the way, I'm fine now. I'll fast forward to the end. That's gone. And it's thanks to learning about mast cell theory. It's thanks to the great doctors that I've become acquainted with during this process. By the time I turned 30, this was about 2010, right around the time I was starting my incubator, I started losing my voice 4 or 5 days out of the week. It's okay until about noon or 1 o'clock, and then it would just disappear on me. So I went to a number of specialists for that, GI guys, throat guys, etc. Had a number of scopes done. The conclusion of all that was they said, elevate the head of your bed by 6 inches. The same with the trigeminal neuralgia. I had my teeth ground down. I tried acupuncture, chiropractic, etc. And I remember very well when I was 22, went to my primary doctor, told him what was going on, said I've got 7 out of 10 chronic pain. What does he do? He runs a blood panel. And I think he was trying to be helpful when he came back and he read the blood panel and he said, you know what? You're the healthiest guy I've seen all week. And that's another very common story with mast cell disease. So I certainly knew how I felt. And so the best way to interpret that, being a data guy, is that I thought his data was probably incomplete. And as it turns out, mast cells, which have been known to science for almost 150 years, have largely been overlooked during all that time. Why is that? Going all the way back to Hippocrates, medicine is focused on the blood, and that's been exceptionally productive. Reading blood, the various chemicals and mediators that are in there. Mast cells are not in the blood. You take a blood sample, you're going to find effectively no mast cells in there. Just a few juveniles that are moving from where they're born in the bone marrow to the tissue where they ultimately end up. And as a result of that, mast cells, for the most part, are known to cause allergies and anaphylaxis, and that's kind of it. But about 25 years ago, with the first gene-edited mouse, they knocked out something called the KIT gene, which is the one that controls mast cells. And they were doing tests then on the 2 mice. And they started seeing some really interesting things. That these mice that didn't have mast cells didn't develop arthritis. That they didn't develop a number of the different conditions that plague inflammation. Now, of course, a mouse without mast cells also doesn't live very long. They're necessary for our survival, but when they become chronically overactivated, they cause chronic inflammatory disease. And this makes good evolutionary sense if you think about it, right? If your immune system's going to choose between letting you die of an infection or being a little overly exuberant, it's going to choose the latter. And what you're going to end up with is chronic inflammation. One second. Okay, so by the time I was 40, my career was reaching all-time highs. By 2019, I was making 8 figures a year, had been doing so steadily. Rodrigo and I were blowing the doors off, along with Nick, blowing the doors off of all expectations in the business. We ended up pulling in well over the 250 million that we expected. We had a 40% profit share, and we were just raking it in. But while my career was at an all-time high, my health was at an all-time low. Similar to Wolfgang, in 2019, I was down to 5 safe foods. We're in a lot of options, but I continued to look. I went to an allergist here in town, the best one. He ran a full allergy panel, 500 different substances, tested all of them. Came in, he said, I have wonderful news for you. Came back clean. You're not allergic to anything. And again, that's very common. And once again, the way to interpret this is not that I wasn't sick, because by that time, I was having trouble making it through the day. I was taking a nap in my car for an hour every afternoon, allergic to smells, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, I've been doing my research. I'm kind of a geek in everything I do, and I approach my health the same way I approach my startups, which is to test, look for options, follow the data, follow the most promising path. And so I asked him whether or not he thought histamine intolerance might be a thing. He said, yeah, possible. And then he said two things that altered the course of my life. He said, it's possible that it's a mast cell issue. That was number one. And he said, the best doctors in the world for this are Dr. Lawrence Afrin, based out of New York, and Dr. Gerhard Molderis, based out of Germany. And that was the bottom of the V for me. From that day forward, everything got better. Because I went home, I did my research. I got on Dr. Afrin's 6-month waiting list. He doesn't take insurance. It was a $10,000 appointment, well beyond what your average person could afford. I was fortunate to be able to do so. I bought his book, read it cover to cover, and if you or a loved one suffers from any sort of inflammatory disease, go out and buy this book tonight. It's called Never Bet Against Occam. His premise is very simple. Afrin's a smart guy, as is Mulder's. The premise is someone like me who has a couple of dozen different conditions, skin conditions, migraines, upper GI, lower GI, chronic fatigue, canker sores, things like that. What's more likely? Occam's razor tells us that the simplest answer tends to be the most correct. And is it more likely that people like me and people like Wolfgang, people like Aaron, are so unlucky, born under a bad star, that they accumulate a collection of unrelated conditions? And that's how medicine treats them. It's a necessity. Medicine's gotten so complex that we have skin doctors and GI doctors and throat doctors, etc., right? So is it more likely that we're just unlucky? Or is it more likely that there's one single cause underlying all the separate conditions? Maybe that cause, if you think about something like the germ theory of disease 100 years ago, we had all these different conditions. Malaria, Latin for malaria, which was believed to be noxious vapors that came in at night, right? And there was actually a doctor, a Navy doctor at the time, that noticed if you put screens on windows, it helped with malaria. His thesis was that it filtered and purified the air. We have tuberculosis, a bunch of the other ones, right? And then we figured out 100 years ago that these aren't separate conditions. There's a single thing, a bacterium, that underlies all of them. And then with the advent of penicillin, we were able to wipe out and treat billions of people. And that's the picture that started to emerge for me. When I went up and I saw Dr. Afrin in New York, he was able to confirm through specialized lab tests, that indeed I did have this new diagnosis that's been out for less than a decade called MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. I'd never heard of it before. 3 years ago, I'd never heard of a mast cell. And with Dr. Afrin's guidance, I began testing various over-the-counter supplements, prescription medications. Even today, I'm on a portfolio of about 10 to 15, excuse me, 10 to 15. This is just a dry throat, not the other. Liv, would you bring me my nitro? Thank you. Helps with everything. I guess that's what you call a shameless plug, right? And I got better. Not perfect, but better. And it's a collection, what I take now, it's a collection of antihistamines, vitamins, mast cell stabilizers, things like that. I started a nonprofit to study mast cells, and I threw myself into the science, and that's when Wolfgang showed up. Of course, I had heard of NC Sciences because Dr. Afton, Dr. Molderings were on the board. They were reading, or I was reading all the papers that they published. And what came together for me was a very unique investment case. Now, I give a few $1,000s to charity every year. This is not a charity. Far from it. I actually think it's the single best investment prospect that I could imagine. Maybe Mitra's better. I don't know, but they're close. They're both what Rodrigo and I, Rodrigo's got a Hispanic background. They're both what we call Trace Thomas bets. Multi-billion-dollar bets. And the bet on this one, I don't want to oversell it. Because as Wolfgang said, what you find with mast cell theory is that it almost sounds too good to be true. But the picture that started to show up for me is that just like 100 years ago, penicillin was able to solve billions of cases of different bacterial diseases. The product that Wolfgang, Dr. Molderings, Dr. Afrin, 30 or 40 other of the top specialists in the world may be able to be the penicillin of inflammatory diseases. And for me as an investor, of course it's venture, so there's a million things that can go wrong. But for me to say, number one, what would it mean financially to own a chunk of the next penicillin? And what would it mean for the world? I personally handicap it at about a 30% chance. If you ask the guys at Evotech, they put it higher. They say 50. Mast cell, the mast cell industry and the science and the business side has moved at lightning speed since I first learned about it 3 years ago. And where we are now is we've got esteemed gentlemen like Mr. Adam Hutton, who's on the board of NC Sciences, former head of venture at AbbVie. And we've got gentlemen like that, as well as the top venture capitalists and top companies in the world, very interested in all of this. What they're saying is, we just need a little more data. So that's what Wolfgang and his team are working on, as well as obviously optimizing the molecules along the way. So as a call to action, what I would say is we're around for the rest of the evening. Love to talk to you more about this, as well as we're available tomorrow. And once again, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening to my sob story. And very much looking forward to the next steps on this bet. So, Aaron?